The streets of Phnom Penh, in the early morning of April 17, 1975, carried a deceptive calm. For weeks, rumors had swept through the city. The Khmer Rouge, a mysterious revolutionary force from the countryside, had encircled the capital. The government of Lon Nol had collapsed under the weight of civil war, corruption, and exhaustion. Hospitals were overflowing with the wounded, food supplies were dwindling, and families clung to whispers of peace. And then, on that hot, dusty morning, the black-clad soldiers finally arrived. They did not come with tanks or roaring machines of war. Instead, they entered on foot and on trucks. Young men and women dressed in simple black uniforms, red checkered scarves around their necks, rifles slung over their shoulders. To the exhausted citizens, their arrival at first seemed like salvation. After 5 years of bombing, war, and terror, Phnom Penh's weary inhabitants poured into the streets, cheering, waving white cloths, handing flowers to the newcomers. Some whispered, "The war is finally over." But peace did not come. Within hours, the smiling masks dropped, and the true face of the Khmer Rouge revealed itself. Loudspeakers mounted on trucks blared orders. "The Americans are coming to bomb the city. Everyone must evacuate immediately. Leave your homes, leave the hospitals, leave the markets. Go to the countryside at once." At first, many thought it was temporary, perhaps a few days away until the danger passed. But this was no temporary evacuation. This was the beginning of one of the greatest forced exoduses in human history. On that very day, Phnom Penh, a bustling city of 2 million souls, was emptied almost entirely. Mothers carried infants on their hips. The elderly hobbled on canes. Patients too weak to walk were wheeled out of hospitals, IV tubes still dangling from their arms. Soldiers barked orders and fired shots into the air to quicken the pace. Anyone who resisted, anyone who asked questions, anyone who appeared unwilling, was shot on the spot. The march into the countryside was relentless. The scorching Cambodian sun beat down on endless lines of evacuees, stretching across roads and rice fields. Families clutched whatever they could, carry blankets, pots, rice sacks. Photographs until fatigue forced them to abandon their belongings along the roadside. The sick and the elderly collapsed. Children cried for water. And when someone fell behind, a young soldier in black would raise his rifle, and the crying would stop. Phnom Penh was not the only city. Across Cambodia, Battambang, Siem Reap, Kampong Cham, and dozens of other towns suffered the same fate. The Khmer Rouge's message was clear. Cities were parasites, centers of corruption and exploitation. The future, they proclaimed, belonged to the countryside, to the peasant, to the soil. In the eyes of Pol Pot and his inner circle, the cities had to die so that their vision of a pure agrarian society could be born. Behind this vision lay years of secrecy and ideology. Saloth Sar, better known by his Nam de guerre Pol Pot, had studied in Paris in the 1950s, where he absorbed radical Marxist and Maoist theories. Upon his return to Cambodia, he nurtured a clandestine movement among students and intellectuals, one that grew steadily in the shadows. During the 1960s and early 1970s, his faction, later known as the Khmer Rouge, took root in the jungles, gaining strength as civil war consumed Cambodia. They watched as US bombs devastated the countryside, as peasants fled to the capital, and as Lon Nol's corrupt government alienated its own people. By the mid-1970s, their moment had come, yet few could have predicted the scale of their ambition. This was not merely a political revolution, it was a complete reordering of society. Pol Pot envisioned a Cambodia without money, without markets, without schools, without doctors, without religion, without family bonds as they had been known for centuries. He dreamed of a nation where everyone worked the fields, where the new people from the cities would be cleansed through labor, and where even the idea of individuality would be erased. The first victims of this utopia were the very people who had once welcomed the Khmer Rouge into their streets. Doctors and nurses were forced to abandon patients mid-surgery. Teachers and engineers were told their education meant nothing in the new order. Monks were stripped of their robes. Children were torn from their families, placed into collective groups where loyalty to Angkar, the mysterious name of the organization, was demanded above all. The suffering was immediate. Along the endless marches, food was scarce, water scarcer still. Disease spread through the columns of evacuees. Mothers watched helplessly as their children withered. The countryside that Pol Pot idolized could not sustain millions of new arrivals overnight, yet the soldiers showed no mercy. When questions were asked, "Where are we going?" When can we return? The only answer was the barrel of a gun. Witnesses remember the silence that fell over Phnom Penh once the people were gone. Streets once filled with laughter, markets once alive with bargaining, houses once echoing with music and prayer rolls stood empty. Hospitals were deserted, surgical tools rusting under the tropical sun. Schools became prisons. Buddhist pagodas were desecrated, monks executed, statues of the Buddha smashed into rubble. The capital of Cambodia had become a ghost city, a symbol of the regime's merciless vision. And still, most did not yet realize the nightmare that awaited them. For many evacuees, the countryside meant hope, perhaps food, perhaps safety, perhaps a return to normal life after a few weeks. But Pol Pot's design was far darker. This forced march was only the beginning. Soon, collective farms would swallow entire families. Forced labor camps would grind bodies to dust. And the very idea of humanity, of compassion, of individuality, of freedom would be declared an enemy of the state. April 17, 1975, marked the day the city fell. But more than a city fell that day. A whole nation was shackled, dragged into a brutal social experiment, and thrust toward a genocide that would claim nearly 2 million lives. The cheering in the morning had turned to crying by nightfall, and in the jungles of Cambodia, the leaders of Angkar smiled, convinced that the birth of their year zero had finally begun. When the endless march from the cities finally ended, the survivors found themselves scattered across a countryside that was no longer their own. Villages that had once been small, self-sufficient communities were suddenly swollen with thousands of displaced souls. Bamboo huts overflowed with strangers, rice paddies teemed with new workers. Yet this was not hospitality. This was not a homecoming. This was the beginning of year zero. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge proclaimed that Cambodian history itself had been erased. Everything that came before April 17, 1975, no longer mattered. Ancient kingdoms, colonial legacies, even family lineages. From that day onward, the calendar of the nation was reset. Cambodia was reborn, they declared, as a pure agrarian utopia, free of corruption, free of foreign influence, free of the poisons of modern civilization. But for the millions who had stumbled from Phnom Penh and other cities, the new year began not with celebration, but with chains of hunger, exhaustion, and terror. They were given a new identity, the new people. It was not a title of honor, it was a mark of shame. In the eyes of the regime, new people were polluted, educated, urban, tainted by modern life. They were to be re-educated through labor, reduced to the level of peasants, stripped of pride, memory, and hope. The fields of Angkar, each family was herded into collective work camps that sprawled across Cambodia like veins of a poisoned heart. Bamboo barracks rose hastily in the fields, where entire villages of evacuees were forced to live together, eating from the same pot, working the same soil. From dawn until deep into the night, men, women, and children bent over rice paddies, digging canals with bare hands, hauling earth in wicker baskets, chopping through the jungle to carve out new farmland. Food was scarce. Rations were deliberately meager, watery rice porridge, sometimes flavored with salt or wild roots. Starvation became a companion to every breath. To speak of hunger was forbidden. To steal a handful of grain was punishable by death. And yet, some risked everything for a few kernels of rice hidden in their palms, because hunger gnawed harder than fear. The guards, the base people, who had lived in the countryside before the revolution, watched with suspicion. They were told by Angkar that the new people were dangerous parasites, enemies of the revolution, spies of foreign powers. The slightest mistake, a stumble in the mud, a whispered complaint, a glance considered arrogant, could lead to a beating or execution. And above all, there was Angkar, the faceless, omnipotent organization. No one truly knew who Angkar was. Orders came from the shadows, whispered by cadres, repeated in slogans. Angkar has the eyes of a pineapple, lit, sees all. The people were taught to believe that Angkar was everywhere, in every hut, in every paddy, inside every thought. To disobey Angkar was to invite death. The destruction of the family. The Khmer Rouge's war was not only against cities and institutions, but against the very fabric of family. Husbands and wives were separated into different work brigades. Children were taken from their parents, placed into youth collectives, where they were indoctrinated from dawn until dusk. The young were taught to spy on the old, to report the words of their mothers, their fathers, their neighbors. Loyalty to Angkar outweighed blood. Marriages, once sacred unions blessed by tradition, became tools of the state. Couples were forced into arranged weddings, sometimes with complete strangers, sometimes in mass ceremonies where dozens of pairs stood silently before cadres, stripped of joy or consent. The purpose was not love, but controlled the production of obedient citizens and future laborers. Parents who dared to show too much affection risked suspicion. A mother cradling her sick child too tenderly might be accused of weakness, of placing family above Angkar. Many learned to harden their faces, to swallow their tears, to pretend indifference as their children withered before their eyes. The death of knowledge nowhere was the cruelty of Year Zero, clearer than in its hatred of knowledge. Teachers, doctors, engineers, artisans were branded as threats. To wear glasses was enough to draw suspicion, a symbol of education. Many intellectuals, once pillars of Cambodian society, vanished into the shadows of the night, taken away to be executed in the jungle or at hidden prisons. Books were burned, schools were converted into barracks and torture chambers, hospitals were stripped of their doctors, who were now forced into the fields. A generation that had once dreamed of progress was silenced. The Khmer Rouge envisioned a society where ignorance was purity, where obedience was wisdom, where the only knowledge worth keeping was the will of Angkar. The silence of the countryside, witnesses later described the eerie silence of those years. Villages where laughter had once echoed became graveyards of whispers. No one dared to speak freely. Even the smallest words could kill. To say I am hungry was to admit weakness. To complain about the work was to reveal disloyalty. To question Angkar was to invite execution. So silence reigned. The sound of shovels in the soil, the cries of infants too weak to nurse, the splash of bare feet in flooded paddies became the soundtrack of daily life. At night, when the stars shone over the rice fields, families huddled in their huts, their stomachs hollow, their hearts pounding at every footstep outside. A knock at the door could mean disappearance. Year Zero in the eyes of the survivors for the survivors. Year Zero was not a calendar, it was a wound. It was the year when names were erased, when families dissolved, when temples fell silent, when every joy of the past was declared an enemy of the future. It was the year when neighbors turned against neighbors, when children were taught to betray parents, when the very act of survival demanded silence and submission. Pol Pot believed he was building paradise, but what rose instead was a nation of ghosts, of gaunt faces bent over the soil, of bones hidden beneath shallow graves. The promise of Year Zero was a lie, written in hunger, enforced by bullets, and carved into the flesh of a nation. By the end of 1975, Cambodia was no longer recognizable. Its cities had become empty shells, its temples desecrated, its people broken into collectives of fear and starvation. Yet this was only the foundation. The worst was yet to come. For Angkar was not content with silence, it demanded blood, and soon the killing fields would begin to bloom. The revolution that began with marches and silence soon revealed its darkest face. By late 1975 and into the years that followed, Angkar no longer sought only obedience, it sought purification. Cambodia, Pol Pot declared, must be cleansed of traitors, enemies, and all those who stood in the way of the perfect agrarian society. But who were these enemies? The answer was simple. Anyone Angkar decided. The endless list of enemies at first. The Khmer Rouge targeted officials of the old government, soldiers, bureaucrats, police officers, and anyone tied to the Lon Nol regime. They disappeared in the night, dragged to hidden camps, and never seen again. But soon the circle widened. Intellectuals were condemned, monks executed, foreigners hunted down, farmers accused their neighbors of laziness, children accused parents of speaking forbidden words, cadres accused one another of treason. Under Pol Pot's rule, paranoia was policy. Better to kill an innocent than to spare an enemy, the cadres were told. With that single commandment, Cambodia descended into a nightmare. Tool slang, the gate to death. In Phnom Penh, an old-school building was transformed into the most infamous prison of the Khmer Rouge, Tool slang security prison 21S. Here, classrooms became torture chambers. Chalkboards were replaced with shackles and iron beds. Windows were covered with barbed wire to prevent desperate prisoners from throwing themselves to their deaths. The blackboards of children once carried equations, now they carried the screams of the dying. At Tool slang, no one was innocent. Prisoners were forced to write endless confessions, admitting to crimes they had never committed, spying for the CIA, working for the KGB, betraying Angkar. Torture extracted these lies: whippings, electric shocks, waterboarding, pulling out fingernails, suffocating with plastic bags. Every scream was written down, every word recorded, every face photographed. But confessions did not bring freedom, they brought execution. After weeks of torment, prisoners were trucked to the outskirts of the city, to a quiet field at Chuang Ik. There, under the cover of night, they were slaughtered and thrown into shallow pits. Of the 14,000 men, women, and children sent to Tuol Sleng, only a handful survived. The killing fields Tuol Sleng was but one gate. Across Cambodia, hundreds of killing fields spread like scars across the land. They were not battlefields, but execution sites: rice paddies, orchards, bamboo groves, turned into open-air cemeteries. Here, death was delivered with crude efficiency. Bullets were considered too expensive. Instead, victims were bludgeoned with hoes, axes, wooden clubs, even palm fronds sharpened into blades. Babies were swung against tree trunks. Entire families were silenced in a single night. Mass graves swallowed them all. In some pits, hundreds of skeletons lay entangled, skulls shattered, jaws frozen. After the rains, bones and scraps of clothing surfaced from the soil, as if the earth itself refused to hide the horror. The killing fields were not hidden from the people. They were meant as a warning. Rumors spread like whispers on the wind. Do not speak. Do not question. Angkar is listening. Terror, as a way of life. The genius of Pol Pot's terror was its invisibility. There were no courts, no trials, no defense. Arrests happened in the middle of the night. Soldiers arrived without warning, dragged victims from their huts, and left behind only silence. Families never knew why a father, a sister, or a child had been taken. To ask was to risk joining them, so people stopped asking. They lived in terror of a knock on the door, of footsteps in the dark, of their own children's words. Even cadres themselves were not safe. Suspicion could fall on anyone. In some provinces, whole units of Khmer Rouge soldiers were purged, accused of betrayal, executed in the same pits as those they once guarded. Terror was the bloodstream of Year Zero. It kept people silent, obedient, hollow. The machinery of death. What made the Khmer Rouge different from other dictatorships was not only the cruelty of its killings, but the cold, bureaucratic order behind them. Every victim was photographed before execution. Every confession was archived. Every grave was catalogued. Even death became a statistic, a record, a line in Angkar's ledger. And yet, behind this machinery, there was a chilling absence of reason. Victims were executed not for what they had done, but for what they were: a teacher, a monk, a mother, a child. To be alive was to be suspect. To survive was to live with the knowledge that survival itself was fragile, borrowed, undeserved. Survivors' voices decades later. Survivors would tell their stories. One remembered seeing his mother led away, her hands bound, her face calm as she disappeared into the night. Another recalled the silence of Tuol Sleng, where screams echoed down hallways but names were never spoken. A child survivor described clinging to her sister as soldiers dragged their father into the jungle, his footsteps fading like a drumbeat of doom. They remembered the smell of death in the air, the soil that shifted underfoot where bodies lay beneath, the eerie silence that followed every execution. And they remembered the crushing knowledge that no prayer, no plea, no tears could change Angkar's will. A nation of ghosts. By 1977, the killing fields had become part of the Cambodian landscape. Every village knew of them, every family feared them, and yet life continued: rice planting by day, executions by night. Children grew up not with lullabies, but with whispers of fear. The Khmer Rouge's promise of paradise had become a kingdom of graves. Cambodia was no longer a nation of the living, it was a nation of ghosts who walked the fields, worked the soil, and waited in silence for their turn to be swallowed by the earth. But Pol Pot was not done. His paranoia grew sharper, his circle of trust smaller, his thirst for purity more relentless. Even within his own movement, he saw enemies everywhere. The purges spread from the peasants to the cadres, from the villages to the highest ranks of Angkar, and soon the killing fields would not only claim the innocent, they would claim the revolutionaries themselves. The Khmer Rouge had silenced the cities, enslaved the countryside, and filled the earth with graves. Yet for Pol Pot, this was not enough. His obsession was purity of ideology, purity of loyalty, purity of blood. And in his eyes, danger lurked not only among the new people, dragged from Phnom Penh, danger also lurked within the heart of his own revolution. The seeds of suspicion. Pol Pot rarely appeared in public, but his presence was everywhere. His words, carried through cadres, echoed like scripture. Angkar is your mother and father. Angkar knows what you think. Angkar sees what you do. Yet beneath his soft-spoken demeanor lay a mind consumed by suspicion. As Cambodia starved, Pol Pot grew convinced that traitors were sabotaging his vision. Crop failures, the work of hidden enemies, resistance in villages, seer spies, shortages of rice, Vietnamese infiltrators. The problem with paranoia is that it spreads like fire, and in Pol Pot's Cambodia, suspicion became a weapon sharper than any blade. Purging the ranks. At first, the purges targeted mid-level cadres accused of incompetence. A village chief might be accused of hoarding rice. A cooperative leader might be branded a spy. They were dragged away in the night, their families executed, their names erased. But soon, the circle closed in. The entire regional commands of the Khmer Rouge were dismantled. In the eastern zone, thousands of loyal revolutionaries men, who had fought for years in the jungles, were accused of plotting with Vietnam. Some were tortured into confessing. Others were executed without trial. No one was safe. The very soldiers who once carried out executions found themselves blindfolded, bound, and cast into the same pits as their victims. Guards whispered among themselves, terrified. A single accusation was enough to turn executioner into condemned. The machinery of fear, tool slaying, once reserved for class enemies, now filled with Khmer Rouge cadres themselves. Officers, party members, even senior officials were shackled to the same iron beds as the people they had once condemned. Torture extracted confessions of imaginary plots, alliances with the CIA, loyalty to Hanoi, betrayal of Angkar. Every confession birthed new names. A prisoner, broken by pain, would write the names of comrades, friends, even family. Those names would be hunted down in turn. Fear spread like a virus, devouring the revolution from within. One former cadre later recalled, "When my comrade disappeared, I did not dare to ask where he went. The next day I worked in the fields beside his empty place. I did not dare to look up. I only prayed that my name would not be called next." Pol Pot's circle narrows. As the years passed, Pol Pot's trust shrank to a tiny inner circle: Nuon Chi, Ing Suri, Q Samphinmin, bound not by loyalty alone, but by shared complicity. They knew that to question him was death. To disagree was death. Even to hesitate was death. Pol Pot saw plots everywhere. He saw betrayal in the eastern zone, treason in the northern zone, spies in the ranks of his own army. He believed that only relentless purges could preserve the revolution. And so he unleashed wave after wave of executions, until the Khmer Rouge was devouring itself, its own blood feeding the killing fields. The betrayal of trust for the ordinary people trapped in the labor camps. The purges were both terrifying and strangely invisible. They saw cadres vanish, officials disappear, new commanders replace the old. They heard whispers that the revolution was being cleansed. But what they understood most was this: trust was dead. No one could be trusted, not neighbors, not comrades, not even family. A careless word could lead to death. A child's innocent remark could condemn a parent. And a loyal cadre, once feared by the peasants, might be gone by morning, his name whispered only in fear. The spiral of madness. By 1978, paranoia had consumed the Khmer Rouge entirely. The purges no longer followed logic. Villages were emptied, cooperatives dismantled, soldiers executed by the hundreds. The eastern zone, accused of sympathizing with Vietnam, was virtually annihilated. Tens of thousands of its inhabitants were slaughtered, their corpses filling new mass graves. The revolution had turned inward, cannibalizing its own children. Pol Pot's quest for purity had become a spiral of madness, where loyalty was never enough and survival was always temporary. The shadow of Vietnam. Beyond Cambodia's borders, another storm was brewing. Vietnam, once an ally, now watched with alarm as Pol Pot's regime grew increasingly hostile. Khmer Rouge forces raided across the border, massacring Vietnamese villagers. In Pol Pot's mind, Vietnam was the ultimate threat, the foreign enemy plotting to destroy his revolution. And so, while his people starved and his cadres bled, Pol Pot prepared for war. The devouring revolution, the Khmer Rouge, began as a movement of promises of equality, of purity, of freedom from corruption. But by 1978, it had become a black hole, consuming everything in its path. It consumed the cities, it consumed the peasants, it consumed the educated, it consumed the monks, and now it consumed itself. The revolution devoured its own flesh, leaving behind only bones, silence, and fear. But revolutions that devour themselves cannot last forever. The hunger of Ankara was insatiable, but its enemies were closing in, and soon the Khmer Rouge would face a force it could not silence, a force that would march across the border and shatter the nightmare. The end was coming. But before the regime collapsed, it would tighten its grip in one final storm of blood. By 1978, Cambodia had become a land of silence and fear. The killing fields spread like scars across the countryside. The rivers ran shallow with hunger, and the people bent under the crushing weight of Ankara. Yet Pol Pot's gaze was fixed not only inward, his paranoia turned outward, toward the ancient rival across the eastern frontier, Vietnam. Old wounds, new hatreds. The relationship between Cambodia and Vietnam had always been uneasy, shaped by centuries of war, rivalry, and shifting borders. But under Pol Pot, old resentments hardened into hatred. He was convinced that Vietnam, now unified after its long war with America, sought to dominate Cambodia, to swallow his fragile revolution. Pol Pot's response was not diplomacy, but blood. He ordered his soldiers, many of them teenagers hardened in the fields, to raid Vietnamese villages along the border. They crossed the Mekong and slipped through the forests, striking without mercy. Entire hamlets were burned to the ground. Families were butchered in their sleep. Survivors remembered the terror. Khmer Rouge soldiers storming into homes with knives, machetes and hoes, killing indiscriminately. Children, the elderly, even livestock were slaughtered, as if the land itself had been declared an enemy. To Pol Pot, these massacres were not crimes. They were proof of loyalty. They were acts of purification. They were his way of striking first against the phantom of Vietnamese invasion. The massacre at Bachc, among the bloodiest of these raids, was the massacre at Ba, a small Vietnamese town near the Cambodian border. In April 1978, Khmer Rouge troops poured across the frontier and descended upon the community. For 2 weeks, they killed without pause. Men were hacked to death in front of their families. Women were raped, then executed. Children were smashed against temple walls. The elderly were burned alive in their homes. Out of 3,000 villages, only a handful survived. The rest were left as corpses in fields, temples, and wells. The horror of Bachc seared itself into the Vietnamese memory. It was no longer a border skirmish. It was a wound that demanded vengeance. The war Pol Pot wanted. Pol Pot's attacks were not reckless accidents. They were deliberate provocations. He believed that constant aggression would prove Cambodia's strength, rally his cadres and keep the population terrified and obedient. To him, war with Vietnam was inevitable, and better fought sooner than later. But his calculations were blind. Cambodia was starving, its army poorly equipped, its people broken. Vietnam, by contrast, was battle-hardened, supplied by the Soviet Union, and commanded by generals who had defeated both the French and the Americans. Still, Pol Pot pressed forward. He declared Vietnam the greatest enemy of Ankara, the shadow behind every famine, every rebellion, every failure. In his speeches, he promised total victory. In reality, he was leading his nation toward annihilation. The people caught between 4 ordinary Cambodians. The war was another layer of terror. Families already weakened by years of forced labor now watched their sons conscripted into the army, marched barefoot to the border, and handed rifles older than themselves. Many never returned. In the villages near the frontier, people lived in constant fear of Khmer Rouge raids against suspected traitors, fear of Vietnamese retaliation, fear of being accused of sympathy for the enemy. Survival meant silence. Survival meant obedience. But even obedience could not stop the tide of war. Vietnam strikes back. By the summer of 1978, Vietnam's patience had run out. After repeated raids and the massacre at Ba Pa, the Vietnamese leadership made a fateful decision. Pol Pot's regime had to be destroyed. At first, Vietnam struck cautiously, launching limited incursions into Cambodian territory. But Pol Pot's soldiers responded with greater brutality, killing villagers they accused of collaborating with the enemy. The cycle of violence deepened, feeding the river of blood. The Khmer Rouge propaganda machine told the people that Vietnam was a mortal threat, a foreign invader seeking to erase Cambodia. But many Cambodians, broken by hunger and grief, quietly prayed that the Vietnamese army would come. For them, liberation even by a foreign hand was the only hope of survival. The crack in the wall as 1978 drew to a close. Cracks spread through the walls of Angkor, famine deepened, purges multiplied, and whispers of rebellion flickered in the darkness. Some cadres defected to Vietnam. Some villagers quietly resisted, hiding food or fleeing into the forests. Pol Pot, blind to the crumbling foundation beneath him, raged harder. His speeches grew more violent, his orders more desperate. He promised his people victory. What awaited them was invasion. Toward the final collapse, the border of blood could not hold. In December 1978, Vietnam launched a massive counteroffensive, sending tens of thousands of troops into Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, unprepared for such force, began to collapse. Villages fell, provinces crumbled, cadres deserted. Phnom Penh trembled once more. This time, the city's silence would not last. The nightmare of Pol Pot was reaching its end. Yet even as his regime crumbled, Pol Pot would not admit defeat. He fled into the jungles, carrying his ideology like a torch in the darkness, determined to keep the flame alive no matter how many lives it consumed. The killing was not over, but the fall had begun. The final act of Pol Pot's revolution began not with whispers, but with thunder. On December 25, 1978, as much of the world celebrated Christmas, the Vietnamese army launched a massive invasion across the Cambodian border. Tens of thousands of soldiers, backed by artillery, tanks, and air support, surged westward in a wave of firepower that the Khmer Rouge could never match. For years, Pol Pot had taunted his neighbor with border raids and massacres. Now, the storm he had summoned had come to sweep him away. A collapsing army, the Khmer Rouge fighters who faced the invasion were a mix of hardened guerrillas and terrified conscripts, many of them teenagers pulled from the rice fields, handed rifles, and told to defend Angkor with their lives. Malnourished and poorly equipped, they marched barefoot across muddy fields, their faith in victory crumbling with every mile. The Vietnamese advance was swift, disciplined, unstoppable. Town after town fell. Entire Khmer Rouge divisions melted away, deserting into the forests or surrendering outright. Still, Pol Pot demanded resistance. He ordered counterattacks, declared victory in speeches, and insisted that Angkor's will alone could defeat the enemy. But ideology cannot stop tanks, and empty slogans cannot feed starving soldiers. The people's silent hope, as the Vietnamese army pushed deeper into Cambodia. The civilian population watched with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. For years, they had lived under the yoke of starvation, fear, and silence. Now they faced a foreign army marching across their villages. But the Vietnamese soldiers were not like the cadres in black. They did not burn houses or smash temples. Instead, they brought rice, medicine, and most of all an end to the midnight knocks at the door. For many Cambodians, the invasion was not occupation. It was liberation. The ghost capital by early January 1979. The Vietnamese army was closing in on Phnom Penh. The once bustling capital was now a ghost city, emptied of its 2 million inhabitants. Its markets silent, its schools and hospitals abandoned. The Khmer Rouge had gutted it, turned it into a hollow shell of its former self. Pol Pot, unwilling to admit defeat, ordered a desperate defense. But his inner circle knew the truth. They began to flee into the jungle, carrying with them the remnants of Angkor's archives and treasures. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese troops entered Phnom Penh with little resistance. The city that had once cheered the arrival of black-clad soldiers in 1975 now witnessed a different kind of army that reopened roads, restored markets, and allowed the people to breathe again. Democratic Kampuchea, the nightmare state of Year Zero, had collapsed. The horror revealed in the days that followed, the true scale of Pol Pot's terror began to surface. Villagers led soldiers to the mass graves scattered across the countryside. Shallow pits filled with bones, skulls cracked by blows, scraps of clothing still clinging to the dead. In Phnom Penh, the Vietnamese uncovered tool slang S-21, abandoned by the fleeing Khmer Rouge. Inside, they found rooms lined with shackles, torture devices, and the haunting photographs of thousands of prisoners who had never left alive. On the floors, dried blood still stained the tiles. On the walls, mugshots of men, women, and children stared out with hollow eyes, frozen at the moment before death. The world would soon see these images, and recoil in horror. Pol Pot in the shadows. But Pol Pot was not finished. From the jungles along the Thai border, he and his surviving cadres regrouped. They declared that their retreat was temporary, that their struggle would continue. For the next 2 decades, the Khmer Rouge would linger like a shadow, fighting a guerrilla war, feeding on foreign aid, and clinging to the dream of return. Yet in that moment, in January 1979, their absolute grip on Cambodia was broken. The terror had been stopped. The silence had been shattered. Liberation in ashes for the Cambodian people. The fall of Phnom Penh was both an ending and a beginning. The nightmare of Pol Pot was over, but the scars remained. Families had been torn apart, children orphaned, entire villages erased. Nearly 2 million people, 1 in every 4 Cambodians, had died. The survivors emerged like ghosts from the rice fields, skeletal and hollow-eyed, stumbling into the ruins of their own country. They carried nothing but memories of hunger, fear, and the endless graves of the dead. And yet, in their survival, there was also defiance. Against all odds, against the machinery of Angkar, against the weight of genocide, they still lived. The world awakes. News of the Khmer Rouge's fall and the horrors uncovered spread rapidly across the globe. Journalists and aid workers entered Cambodia, documenting the devastation. Photographs of mass graves, of emaciated survivors, of tool slangs haunting archives shocked the conscience of humanity. The words killing fields entered the world's vocabulary, and the name Pol Pot became synonymous with cruelty, paranoia, and the destruction of a nation. The nightmare of year 0 had ended, but Cambodia's long journey of healing had only just begun. For the survivors, liberation was not enough to erase the pain. For the dead, justice would come slowly, if at all. And for Pol Pot, hidden in the jungle, the war was far from over. On the morning of January 8, 1979, the people of Phnom Penh began to return. They came slowly, like shadows emerging from the countryside, clutching bundles of rags, carrying skeletal children, their eyes hollow but searching for life. For nearly 4 years, the city had been a ghost, emptied by the orders of Angkar. Now, its streets filled again not with parades or cheers, but with the quiet footsteps of survivors reclaiming their home. Yet Phnom Penh was no longer the same city. Its markets were ruins, its schools abandoned, its hospitals gutted. Electric lines were dead, water pumps broken, temples desecrated. The capital of Cambodia was little more than a skeleton, a hollow husk haunted by memory. Survivors in ashes, the survivors who staggered back carried scars deeper than hunger. Families searched desperately for one another. Mothers wandered through the city calling out the names of lost children. Fathers dug through grave sites, praying to recognize a scrap of clothing. Some families found reunion stares streaming, arms trembling, voices cracking as they embraced after years of separation. But for most, the reunions ended only in silence. Too many had vanished into the pits, into tool slang, into the endless night of the killing fields. In villages, monks returned to shattered pagodas, attempting to rebuild shrines, with hands still trembling from trauma. Farmers tried to coax rice from fields poisoned by neglect. Children, too young to understand, played among bones that rose from the soil after rains. It was a nation of ghosts, but ghosts determined to live again. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, with Phnom Penh secured. Vietnam installed a new government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, led by Cambodian defectors who had fled Pol Pot's purges. The PRK promised stability, food, and a return to normal life. But rebuilding a nation reduced to rubble was no simple task. The Khmer Rouge had destroyed schools, hospitals, even currency. Teachers were dead, doctors gone, records erased. The PRK, with Vietnamese support, began reopening institutions, printing money, and reviving trade. For many survivors, the PRK was salvation. It brought rice, medicine, and order. Yet it was also a government under occupation. Vietnamese soldiers patrolled the streets, and Cambodia's sovereignty was now entangled with Hanoi's influence. To some, the liberators were also occupiers, but for the exhausted survivors, labels mattered little. What mattered was food, safety, and the end of the nightly executions. Pol Pot in the jungle, meanwhile, Pol Pot and his surviving inner circle fled into the dense jungles along the Thai border. Though his regime had fallen, his will remained unbroken. From hidden camps, he declared that the fight was not over, that Angkar still lived. Foreign powers, wary of Vietnam's growing influence in Southeast Asia, continued to treat the Khmer Rouge as a legitimate force. Supplies and weapons trickled into Pol Pot's camps, allowing his guerrillas to regroup. For decades, the jungles along the Cambodian border would echo with the gunfire of Khmer Rouge ambushes. The man who had orchestrated the death of nearly 2 million Cambodians was not finished. His shadow would continue to haunt the land for years to come. The weight of memory for the people of Cambodia, survival itself became an act of resistance. Farmers dug irrigation canals, not for Angkar but for their families. Teachers reopened schools in broken huts, scratching lessons on wooden boards. Mothers sang lullabies to children who had known only silence. But memory was everywhere. Every field was a grave. Every family carried absence. Every survivor lived with the guilt of endurance, the unanswerable question of why they had lived while others had not. At night, some said they could still hear the whispers of Angkar in the wind, the cries of the murdered in the rustling grass. The killing fields were not easily forgotten. They lived in the soil, in the silence, in the hearts of the living. The world watchers as journalists and aid workers entered Cambodia. The world began to understand the scale of the horror. Photographs of skeletal survivors, of skulls stacked in temples, of tool slangs haunting archives, spread across newspapers and television screens. The international community recoiled in shock but also in confusion. Some nations, locked in the politics of the Cold War, refused to recognize the PRK, still treating Pol Pot's regime as Cambodia's official government at the United Nations. Survivors, staring at the graves of their families, could not comprehend how the world still acknowledged the monsters who had destroyed them. Life after liberation was not easy. Hunger still gnawed at bellies. Disease still stalked villages. Mines laid by the Khmer Rouge still exploded beneath farmers' feet. But there was also resilience. Survivors planted rice, rebuilt pagodas, sang forgotten songs. Slowly, life seeped back into the broken soil. Slowly, laughter returned, though often mixed with tears. The nightmare of Pol Pot had ended, but the road ahead was long, filled with rubble, haunted by ghosts, and shadowed by the guerrillas, who still fought in the jungle. The fall of Phnom Penh in 1979 was not the end of the Khmer Rouge. It was the end of their empire, but not of their violence. For in the jungles of Cambodia, Pol Pot waited, plotting, dreaming of return. And for the survivors, the challenge was only beginning. To live again after the unthinkable, to rebuild a nation from ashes, and to carry the weight of memory without being crushed by it. When Phnom Penh fell in January 1979, the nightmare of Year Zero ended, but Cambodia's torment did not. For though Pol Pot's empire was shattered, his shadow still lingered, and the world's great powers would turn Cambodia into a chessboard of Cold War rivalry. The ghosts returned survivors trickled back to the cities, their bodies skeletal, their eyes haunted. Phnom Penh filled again, but not with joy. Families lived in the ruins of abandoned buildings, cooking rice over open fires, sharing stories of the dead. Across the countryside, villagers dug shallow graves, collecting the bones of loved ones, erecting makeshift shrines of bamboo and cloth. The People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, backed by Vietnam, sought to restore order. Schools reopened, hospitals struggled to function, and Buddhist monks were permitted to return to their pagodas. But rebuilding a nation from ashes was slow, and the scars of genocide were everywhere. Food shortages remained desperate. Mines buried by the Khmer Rouge killed farmers in their own fields. Children grew up amid ruins, playing with empty bullet casings instead of toys. Life had returned, but it was fragile, trembling, always under the weight of memory. Pol Pot in the jungle. While Cambodia staggered back to life, Pol Pot retreated to the dense jungles along the Thai border. There, shielded by the thick canopy of bamboo and supported by networks of smuggling and aid, he regrouped his forces. The Khmer Rouge were no longer an empire, but they were still deadly. They waged guerrilla warfare, launching ambushes against Vietnamese troops and attacking villagers loyal to the new government. Civilians once again found themselves caught in the middle, raided by guerrillas at night, patrolled by Vietnamese soldiers by day. In hidden jungle camps, Pol Pot declared that his struggle continued. His radio broadcasts, filled with fire and venom, called on Cambodians to resist the Vietnamese invaders. Even in exile, he maintained a grip on his followers, demanding loyalty, demanding sacrifice, demanding blood. The Cold War's cruel hand, one might have expected the world to unite against the perpetrators of genocide. But the Cold War twisted reality into something crueler. Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, controlled Phnom Penh. For China and the United States, enemies of Moscow, this was unacceptable. And so, in a bitter irony, many nations continued to recognize Pol Pot's regime, Democratic Kampuchea, as Cambodia's legitimate government at the United Nations. Year after year, while survivors lit incense at the graves of their families, Khmer Rouge representatives sat in the UN chamber, speaking in the name of a state built on bones. Aid and supplies, funneled through the complexities of Cold War politics, reached Pol Pot's camps, allowing his fighters to survive. For the Cambodian people, this betrayal was incomprehensible. The world knew the truth. Tuol Sleng's archives had been uncovered. The killing fields revealed, yet the machinery of geopolitics gave the killers another life. A divided land throughout the 1980s, Cambodia remained divided. The PRK held the cities and most of the countryside, but the jungles near the Thai border seethed with insurgency. Alongside the Khmer Rouge, other resistance groups fought as well, united more by their opposition to Vietnam than by any shared vision of the future. Refugee camps swelled along the Thai-Cambodian border. Thousands fled hunger and conflict, crowding into makeshift shelters of bamboo and tarpaulin. Disease spread easily, food was scarce, and gunfire echoed from the forests beyond. For many, survival meant living in limbo, neither in Cambodia, nor truly free across the border, but trapped between worlds, waiting for peace that never seemed to come. The silent struggle of survivors inside Cambodia. Life remained a daily struggle. Farmers worked ruined fields, often barefoot, to save precious sandals. Teachers taught children with no textbooks, only memories. Doctors treated patients with herbs when medicine ran out. Yet even amid hardship, resilience bloomed. Pagodas filled again with prayers. Weddings, once forbidden, returned with laughter and music. Children who had survived the terror of Angkor learned to sing and smile again. But always, the shadow of the Khmer Rouge remained. Guerrilla attacks killed civilians. Mines tore apart bodies. Rumors of Pol Pot's return circulated like ghosts in the night. A nation held hostage for Cambodians. The 1980s were years of survival in a world that had turned their suffering into a pawn of politics. Their country was a battlefield of giants. Vietnam, China, America, the Soviet Union. Their pain was prolonged not by fate, but by strategy. The survivors carried on, but they carried on in the ruins of betrayal. They rebuilt homes, they raised children, they planted rice in blood-soaked soil. But they also watched as the man who had destroyed their families lived freely in the jungle, his crimes shielded by international indifference. By the end of the decade, the winds of the Cold War began to shift. Talks of peace flickered. The great powers, exhausted by proxy wars, started to reconsider Cambodia's future. But for the survivors, a question lingered. Would justice ever come? Or would Pol Pot die in the shadows, unpunished, while the ghosts of Cambodia's 2 million dead cried out for remembrance? By the dawn of the 1990s, the Cold War that had gripped the world for half a century began to thaw. Across Eastern Europe, walls fell, empires crumbled, and superpowers reeled from exhaustion. And with those changes came new possibilities for Cambodia, nation still scarred, still haunted, still waiting for peace. The winds of peace. In 1991, after years of negotiations, the warring factions signed the Paris Peace Accords. For the first time in decades, the promise of peace flickered over Cambodia. The accords called for a ceasefire, the disarmament of factions, and elections supervised by the United Nations. The Khmer Rouge, weakened but not destroyed, was forced to the table. Yet Pol Pot had no intention of surrendering his dream. While the accords promised democracy, Pol Pot still plotted from the jungle, still commanded fighters, still believed he could reclaim Phnom Penh. For ordinary Cambodians, the peace accords brought fragile hope. Refugees began returning home. UN soldiers patrolled villages. Schools reopened with new vigor, and children once again carried books instead of hoes. Yet fear lingered. The Khmer Rouge still stalked the borderlands, still laid mines in the fields, still raided villages under the cover of night. The decline of the Khmer Rouge. Through the 1990s, the Khmer Rouge's power withered. Defections spread through its ranks. Tired of endless war, many fighters laid down their arms, surrendering to the government in exchange for amnesty. Entire units melted away, leaving Pol Pot increasingly isolated. International support also crumbled. The Cold War was over. The logic that had once kept Pol Pot alive no longer mattered. Aid dried up. Borders tightened. The world no longer turned a blind eye to the butcher of Cambodia. By the mid-1990s, the Khmer Rouge was no longer an army, it was a fractured band of guerrillas, surviving in shrinking pockets of jungle, their leader, a fugitive hiding from history. Pol Pot's last stand. Yet Pol Pot refused to let go. Even as his movement disintegrated, he clung to power, ruling his shrinking domain with paranoia and cruelty. In 1997, his obsession with betrayal returned in full force. He ordered the execution of Sun Sen, one of his most loyal comrades, along with Sun Sen's entire family. The killings shocked even his remaining followers. That act of madness proved to be his undoing. Outraged commanders turned against him. In the summer of 1997, Pol Pot was arrested by his own Khmer Rouge faction. No longer the absolute ruler of a nation, he was now a prisoner in the very jungle he once commanded. Footage from that time shows him frail, his once fiery voice reduced to a trembling whisper, his body shrunken by age and illness. The architect of Year Zero, the man who had dreamed of erasing history, now faced the judgment of time. Death in the jungle in April 1998. As international forces closed in and rumors spread that he might soon be handed over to an international tribunal, Pol Pot died. Some said it was a heart attack. Others whispered it was suicide by poison, taken to avoid capture. Whatever the truth, his body was burned quickly, unceremoniously, on a pile of tires in the jungle. No monuments, no shrines, no honors. The man who had once ruled Cambodia with absolute terror left the world in smoke and ashes, his bones scattered, his empire long gone. The slow march toward justice. But Pol Pot's death did not silence the cries for justice. Survivors demanded that the crimes of the Khmer Rouge be judged, that the world recognize their suffering, that history record the truth. In the 2000s, after years of delays, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, ECCC, AU Unbacked Tribunal, was established. Though Pol Pot himself was beyond judgment, several of his top lieutenants faced trial. Nguyen Chi Suri, Q Samphan, and others sat before judges, confronted with the evidence of their crimes. For survivors who testified, the trials were both painful and necessary. They recounted memories of starvation, torture, execution voices trembling, tears falling, but words unbroken. Their testimony carved the truth into history, ensuring that the world would not forget. Justice came late. It was imperfect, but it came. A nation still healing by the end of the 1990s, Cambodia had begun to breathe again. The Khmer Rouge was finished. Refugees returned to rebuild their homes. Children once again filled classrooms with laughter. Markets bustled. Temples rang with the sound of prayer. Yet the scars remained. Mines still lurked in the soil, killing and maiming long after the war had ended. Survivors bore wounds too deep to heal, missing families, shattered memories, nightmares that returned each night. Still, the Cambodian people endured. Against all odds, against genocide, against betrayal, they had survived. And survival itself was a form of victory. Pol Pot was gone. His empire of bones lay buried in the earth, but his shadow lingered in memory, in scars, in the silence of the killing fields. The story of Cambodia did not end with him. It continued with those who lived, who rebuilt, who prayed, who planted rice in blood-soaked soil, and dared to dream of a future free from terror. The twilight of Pol Pot was not only the end of a tyrant, it was the beginning of Cambodia's long, painful journey back to life. The fires of Pol Pot's empire have long burned out, but their ashes remain. Across Cambodia, the legacy of the Khmer Rouge is written not only in history books, but in the very soil and the bones that still rise after the rains, in the silence of survivors who carry the weight of memory. The genocide ended in 1979. Pol Pot died in 1998. The trials concluded in the 2010s. And yet, for Cambodia, the wounds of those years are not measured by calendars. They are measured by scars, scars etched into families, villages, and generations. The memory of bones visitors to Cambodia today can walk among the killing fields, At Chuang Ik, skulls are displayed in a glass stupa, stacked high, as if to remind the living of the price of silence. Fragments of clothing still surface in the dirt. Children play nearby, their laughter mingling with the whispers of the dead. At Tulslang, the old school-turned prison remains preserved. Photographs of prisoners line the walls, faces of men, women, children, frozen in black and white, staring out at history with eyes wide in fear. Each image is a testimony, each face is a voice, each silence is a scream. For survivors, these sites are not museums. They are wounds, yet they are also warnings. Generations of silence and speech. The generation that lived through year zero still struggles with its ghosts. Many lost entire families, entire villages. Some carry memories too heavy to speak aloud. Others break their silence in testimony, their trembling voices carving truth into history. A younger generation born after the genocide grows up amid stories they did not witness but cannot escape. They inherit the silence of their parents, the grief of their grandparents. For them, memory is not only history, it is identity. Teachers, monks, and artists now work to preserve these stories, to ensure that forgetting is never an option. Documentaries, paintings, and literature carry the weight of testimony. The phrase "never again" is whispered, sung, and prayed, though always shadowed by the knowledge that humanity has too often repeated its darkest mistakes. Lessons for the world. The genocide of Pol Pot was not born from chaos alone. It was born from ideology twisted into fanaticism, from fear weaponized into obedience, from silence imposed by terror. It was born from the belief that purity could be achieved by erasing the past, by erasing humanity itself. The lesson is clear. Any society that sacrifices compassion for ideology, any government that demands silence over truth, any leader who places vision above life, such a society teeters on the edge of atrocity. Cambodia's suffering is a warning to the world. Genocide is not the work of monsters from another realm. It is the work of humans. Ordinary people, given orders, given fear, given silence, can become executioners. The strength of survival, and yet, amid the darkness, there is light. The Cambodian people endured. They rebuilt from ashes. They replanted rice in soil soaked with blood. They prayed in temples rebuilt from ruins. They raised children to sing songs of peace instead of silence. Survival itself became defiance. Every laugh of a child, every chant of a monk, every market alive with color is a victory over Angkar's dream of emptiness. Cambodia still carries scars, but it also carries strength, the strength of endurance, of memory, of life. Echoes into the future today. Cambodia is a nation of youth. Most were born after the Khmer Rouge fell. They did not live through year zero, but they walk on its soil. They inherit not only grief, but resilience, not only scars, but the determination to build anew. The echoes of the killing fields remain, but they no longer define the future. They remind, they warn, they teach, but they do not dictate. Cambodia's story continues, written not in terror, but in survival. The final lesson. The story of Pol Pot is not only Cambodian, it is human. It belongs to all nations, all peoples, for it shows how fragile civilization can be, how easily fear can silence compassion, how quickly humanity can vanish when ideology rules above love. But it also shows the power of survival. The people of Cambodia, though broken, endured, and in their endurance, they carried a message to the world. Memory is resistance, remembrance is justice, silence is death. The killing fields are quiet now. The grass sways in the wind. Children's laughter drifts across the bones. Cambodia lives, and in that life, the dead are remembered. The nightmare of year zero is over, but its echoes will speak forever, warning the world, reminding humanity what must never be allowed to return.